We're going to start talking a little bit more about the plant itself today. And so we talked about this idea of photosynthesis, right? And it's this process by which plants have to make their own sugar because plants can't get up and move. So if food's not available, they have to be able to produce food. Because as we hopefully know, in order to make energy, we need food. We really need two things to make energy. We need oxygen and we need food. Now, we get our food by actually going out and getting it, right? We go and we hunt for food, or in realistic times today, we go out to the store and we buy it. But plants can't do that. They have to actually produce their own sugar, their own food, and then they go through the process just like we do of making energy. So, how do plants actually make their own food? Well, it's this process called photosynthesis, and we're going to start off by talking about where it happens. And photosynthesis occurs in a very specific part of a plant cell. So if you remember back to the cell unit, there were a few things that make plant cells different than animal cells. One is that plants have a cell wall, which gives them the structural ability to grow tall, right? We also talked about that plants have that large central vacuole, so they can store water for long periods of time when there's not water available. And then finally, they have these things called chloroplasts, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The chloroplast is the organelle inside of a plant where the actual process of photosynthesis occurs. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of a chloroplast. So, a chloroplast is a membrane-bound organelle, so it's got a membrane around it, and inside we have these things called thylakoids. And what a thylakoid is essentially it's a little sac that is full of chlorophyll. So thylakoids are basically these membranes that have this chlorophyll in the middle, and they actually form stacks of them, and they have a name for them. The stacks are called grana or granum. So on this next diagram here, you can see this would be the chloroplast here. We have our membrane. There's actually two membranes. There's an outer and an inner membrane. But then we have these stacks of things called thylakoids. So each individual membrane is called a thylakoid, and then a stack of those thylakoids are called grana. So it's basically just how they're set up. And then inside of this, membrane-bound organelle, there's a fluid, a liquid, which is called stroma. And stroma is a lot like the cytoplasm in a cell. So the stroma is the liquid which protects and insulates the thylakoids, because this process requires a certain temperature and a certain pH to work. So think of this liquid, the stroma, as being what keeps everything in the right environment for this to function. So this is just another diagram that shows you the same thing. You can see here we have our membrane, right? So it's got this outer membrane and an inner membrane. And then inside we have our individual discs, which are membrane-bound discs which have chlorophyll in them. Those are called thylakoids. A stack of them are called grana, and then we have the liquid stroma. And you can see they're actually connected to each other. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later on. The way I remember this is I think of pancakes, right? An individual pancake would be just one thylakoid. A stack of pancakes, which when you go to a restaurant, you don't order a pancake. You order an order of pancakes, and they usually come 3 to an order. Sometimes you can get a short stack, and that's 2 to an order. But when you get pancakes, they come in a stack. And think of thylakoids coming in a stack called grana. And then stroma, I just think of syrup. When you put syrup over the pancakes, that's the liquid part. So think of the stroma as the syrup. So if I go with my little analogy here, the thylakoids are the pancakes, the stacks of pancakes are the grana, and then the syrup on top is the stroma, and that's the liquid that surrounds it. I want to go over one more thing in this lecture today, and that is the leaf anatomy. Because where does this happen? Well, it happens in the chloroplast. Where are the chloroplasts? The chloroplasts are in the leaf. So when you think about where does photosynthesis take place, the first thing you should think of is green. Because if you remember from the last lecture, the pigment chlorophyll is in the leaves, and that is what actually absorbs the sun's energy. So there's a couple images on the slide. First thing I want to point out to you is this is an actual chloroplast. This is from a microscope. It's a picture from a microscope. So you can see the grana and then the stroma, right? And then this is just that image again we just showed you. This shows you a zoomed in cell. This would be an individual plant cell. You can see the cell wall, and then you can see the chloroplasts floating in that cell. And then finally here we have our leaf. And this is what we're going to talk about now, and we're going to go into some detail on what we're looking at here. So I'm just going to go over some terminology first. I'm going to talk about what the names of the different parts are, and then I'll show you on this diagram here. So this is a diagram, a cross section of a leaf, right? So if you were to take a leaf and just rip it down the middle and look at it from the side, this would be a magnified view of that. So this would be the top of the leaf here, this would be the bottom of the leaf, and then this would be what's inside the leaf. So let's go through it. Okay, so first of all, do leaves breathe? Do plants breathe? And the answer to that question is yes, they do. They breathe just like we breathe. Now, obviously, they don't have lungs, but they have mouths, essentially, that open and close and let out oxygen and let in carbon dioxide. We breathe in oxygen, right? And we breathe out carbon dioxide. That is done when we open our mouth and our lungs expand. Well, plants also need to get carbon dioxide. So how the heck do they get carbon dioxide? The way they do it is through these little openings called stomata. And stomata are pores that are found on the bottom of the leaf, and they open and close to let in carbon dioxide and out oxygen. Now, here's something that's kind of cool about stomata. They open up during the day and they close at night. The question I have on here is why? Why would they be open during the day and closed at night? Well, what doesn't exist at night? The sun, right? And if the sun isn't there, plants can't go through photosynthesis. So if they were to just leave there open, if they were to just leave those pores open all the time, what would end up happening is at night, when there's no actual sun and the plants can't go through photosynthesis, there would just be these openings in the leaf that let water out. And water gets out, and water needs to be held inside the plant. When you sleep at night, you're breathing out water. That's why if you were to weigh yourself right before you went to bed, and then weigh yourself in the morning, you actually weigh less in the morning. And it's not that you're working out at night. What you're doing is you're breathing out water and you're losing weight. You're losing water weight overnight. Well, plants would have the same thing happen to them if they just left their stomata open. So they have these little things on either side of the stomata called guard cells. So if I come back over to here, this would be your stomata here. So that would be the stomata. It looks like a little mouth, right? And on either side, we have these things called guard cells. And they are triggered by sunlight. They open when there's sunlight and they close when there's not. And that is a way for plants to conserve water, but still be able to get what they need to function, which is carbon dioxide, and they let out oxygen. So I know it's on the top of the leaf here, but normally they would be in the bottom. So stomata are at the bottom, and they are what allow oxygen out and carbon dioxide in. Cuticle. If you've ever felt the top of a leaf, it's very waxy, and that is called the cuticle. It's a waxy coating on the top of the leaf, and that serves two jobs. One job is it helps keep water in, right? Because we just talked about the fact that leaves don't want to lose water. But also, where do trees absorb water? At the roots. So when rain comes down, when rain hits the leaf, you want that water to drip off the leaf and onto the ground. So what that cuticle does, that waxy coating, is it allows the water to go down the leaf and down to the ground where there are going to be roots to absorb the water. So the cuticle is the waxy coating on top of the leaf. And if I go back to this diagram here, you can see that. Oops, you can see that here. So this would be that waxy cuticle, this top layer right here. Okay, a couple more things to point out. Veins and arteries, right? So we have veins in our body, and the veins bring blood and arteries bring blood around the body and bring oxygen to the cells, and that's how our cells get their nutrients. Well, trees don't have hearts. They can't pump blood. They don't have blood, but what they do have is they have water and they have sugar, just like we have water and sugar. So they actually have their own system of vessels, like blood vessels, called xylem and phloem. And the xylem is what carries water from the roots up to the leaves. So there's xylem, which is going to be basically a vessel which uses diffusion, high to low concentration, osmosis, and also capillary action to bring water all the way up from the roots to the leaves. And then the phloem is the other type of vessel that takes the sugar that gets made during photosynthesis to the rest of the plant. So think of the phloem as what carries the sugar made in the leaves to the rest of the plant. And then finally, we have this stuff called mesophyll. And mesophyll is the stuff that fills up the leaf. That's the actual cells. They're these little, basically in the cells, they're cells, I should say, that have chlorophyll in them. And there's two types. There's palisades and spongy. The palisade is where the photosynthesis actually happens, and the spongy really has a lot of open areas to hold on to carbon dioxide. So if I go back to the slide here, this is the xylem and the phloem. So this is going to be what we consider the xylem and phloem, which bring water and sugar from the roots to the leaves and from the leaves to the tree. And then we have our spongy mesophyll here, which you can see has open spaces, and that's what allows air to hold, that holds onto carbon dioxide. And then up here, where it's much more orderly, that's the palisade mesophyll, and this is where photosynthesis actually occurs. That's where you're going to have the most chlorophyll present. So just one more time to make sure we understand the difference between the xylem and the phloem. So the xylem are going to be, the roots are going to be in the ground, right? So we have our roots in the ground, and they are what allow water to go up to, they're going to allow water to go up to the leaves. So that's going to be your xylem.